Thank you, Mr. Meal. We now turn to clauses 5 to 7, which deal with elections, as you said, to the Assembly and local government elections in Wales. Clause 5 concerns the power to make provision about Welsh Assembly elections. The clause flows from the St David's Day Agreement, which states that powers relating to elections to the National Assembly for Wales should be devolved. Essentially, the clause gives the Welsh ministers an order-making power to make provision about the conduct of Welsh Assembly elections. It also gives the Secretary of State, subject to the agreement of Welsh ministers, the power to make regulation to combine the polls at Welsh Assembly elections with UK parliamentary elections and, in theory, although this won't matter much in future, with European parliamentary elections too. I'll turn first to new section 13, which this clause substitutes into the Government of Wales Act 2006. This broadly transfers to Welsh ministers the power currently exercised by the Secretary of State to make provision by order about the conduct of Welsh Assembly elections. New section 13 provides that the powers of the Welsh ministers under that section are aligned with the legislative competence of the Welsh Assembly. It also sets out the scope of the order-making power and makes clear that it enables provision to be made on a number of matters, including the registration of electors and the limits of election expenses of individual candidates. It also allows ministers to combine polls. Where more than one poll is held on the same day, they will decide how the polls will be administered. Moving away from the combination of polls, the clause also devolves matters relating to the allocation of regional members at an election, the process for challenging an election, and what should happen if there is a vacancy in the Assembly. Clause 5 also inserts a new section 13A into the Government of Wales Act 2006, which gives the Secretary of State the equivalent power to combine polls at Welsh Assembly elections with UK parliamentary elections and European parliamentary elections. For example, an extraordinary general election for the Assembly could be held on the same day as a general election for the UK Parliament. The exercise of this power by the Secretary of State will be subject to the agreement of Welsh ministers and subject to the affirmative resolution procedure here in the UK Parliament. Clause 6 concerns the timing of elections in Wales. It implements the St David's Day Agreement, which states that while conduct of Assembly elections and local government elections in Wales should be devolved, the Assembly should not be able to decide to hold its elections on the same day as general elections to the UK Parliament, European Parliament or local government elections in Wales. This aspect of the administration and conduct of Assembly and local elections will therefore remain reserved to the UK Parliament. By way of background, to date, each general election that has been held for the Assembly, and there have been 5 in total, has been held in a different year to ordinary local elections in Wales. Further, the Wales Act 2014 amended Section 3 of the Government of Wales Act 2006 so that ordinary general elections to the Assembly are now held every 5 years rather than every 4. This and the provision in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which it superseded, avoided the Assembly general election and the UK parliamentary general election clashing in 2015, and also avoid such a clash in 2020, as the next ordinary general election to the Assembly is now scheduled to be in 2021. The next scheduled local elections in Wales are due to be held in 2017. Local authority elections, the order 2014 made by the Welsh ministers, provided for the local government election date to be moved by 1 year in order to avoid a clash with this year's Assembly election. The clause says that in the event of a clash, Welsh ministers can make an order specifying the alternative day on which the poll of the ordinary Welsh Assembly general election shall be held. It also transfers the existing power of the Secretary of State to move the date of an Assembly general election by up to 1 month to Welsh ministers. Where this power is exercised, that new date cannot fall on the same date as a UK parliamentary general election or a European parliamentary general election. The clause also includes provisions that prevent local government elections in Wales from being held on the same day as an Assembly general election. If there is a clash, Welsh ministers can make an order specifying the alternative day for the local government election to be held. Clause 7 ensures cooperation between Welsh ministers and UK ministers over the online individual electoral registration digital service for Assembly elections and local government elections in Wales. The Assembly is free to decide on the franchise and the registration process for these elections, but as a practical matter, where the Welsh Government wants changes to the Great Britain-wide digital service, they will need the approval of UK Government ministers to do so. That's happening.
I just wondered if the Minister could clarify on this particular point. If the Assembly Ministers have the ability to change the provisions about the registration of electors and potentially to move to an automatic system of registration, or a system which actually ensures we do have people registered, unlike the current system, how is that going to work then with future UK parliamentary elections or other elections? Will they be then using the system that the Welsh Ministers have decided, or would there be somehow some sort of different register for those elections?
Well, Ms. Neal, as the honourable gentleman will be aware, we already run two very heavily overlapping but subtly different electoral registers for local elections, local council elections and parliamentary elections. There are different qualifications. So, for example, if you are an EU national who currently lives in a British city, you may be eligible to vote in a local council election but not in a UK parliamentary election for this place. So we have two heavily overlapping but not identical registers already, and in fact the same thing applies for Scottish parliamentary elections to Holyrood Parliament as well. That will continue, and should the Cardiff Assembly decide that they want to change that in some way further, they will have that competence to do so for the electoral roll for Cardiff Assembly elections. But they will not have the competence to change the registration process or the registration scope for UK parliamentary elections. That is a reserved matter that is to be decided in this building, in this place. And I hope that clarifies the answer for him. But, yeah.
It helps clarify in one respect, but does the Minister not accept there could end up being a very significant discrepancy in the numbers registered for an Assembly election versus UK parliamentary elections? And actually, in terms of how the public understand these things, they don't understand the complexities of all these different registers and lists. If they've registered to vote, they would expect to be able to vote in all elections. And given the huge discrepancy we've seen, just for example, in the EU referendum versus the UK parliamentary registration, which the Boundary Commission are not using, does he not accept there might be a huge discrepancy here?
Well, Mr. Miller, there's always been a difference for very many years between local election registers and parliamentary election registers. That is a very long-standing principle. We're not changing anything about that here. It would be possible, I suppose, should the Welsh Assembly so decide, to make further changes and enfranchise other groups of people who we wouldn't necessarily want to enfranchise for UK parliamentary elections if they wanted to. But at the moment, there is already a difference between the two electoral registers. It has been for a very long time. Nothing about this will change any of that, but in future it will be up to the Welsh Assembly to decide if they want to make further changes which might either narrow or widen the existing long-standing differences.
Very grateful to the Minister. The Minister seems to be saying that the Welsh Government should have the right to displace coincidental elections, but they don't have to. So he seems to be saying it could be the case under the rules that a general election, an Assembly election and even a European election could occur at the same day. And at the same time he's saying it would only be delayed by a month, when in the last episode we saw political parties in Wales only campaigning up to the Assembly and not really mentioning Europe, and then we only had 6 weeks to persuade Wales that they were better off in, and that wasn't enough. So is a month long enough?
I fear I wasn't clear enough. What I'm saying is that there are explicit provisions in the bill to prevent those elections that he just mentioned happening on the same day. So it is not going to be possible to hold, for example, an Assembly general election on the same day as a UK parliamentary general election. That is explicitly prevented in the bill. And were by some future accident of diaries the two things to fall on the same day, then what we're talking about here is the powers for Welsh ministers to move their date, should it be necessary, by up to a month, and for them to have that power rather than for the Secretary of State to have that power in future.
With respect, on the second point, one question was, is a month long enough? It seems to me it isn't long enough. And secondly, it seems to me what he said was that there are powers to move them, but they're not obliged and required to move them. So the Welsh Assembly government could choose to have the two elections on the same day, couldn't they, within this?
Oh, well, Mr. Neal, no, I'm not saying what the honourable gentleman fears I'm saying. I hope I can reassure him on that. The existing power to move things by a month already exists. It just happens to be vested in the Secretary of State. All we're seeking to do here, as part of the devolution settlement, as part of the St David's Day agreement, following the principles set out in that agreement, is to devolve that existing power from the Secretary of State to Welsh ministers. So we're not seeking to change the power in one direction or another. We're just making sure that it's being exercised more locally in Cardiff rather than in Westminster. And again, I just stress that the it is already legally the case, and it continues to be legally the case rather, that the Assembly elections and the UK parliamentary elections cannot happen on the same day. So it would only be a question of moving some of these elections around. In that case, there are maybe other reasons why you might want to, but in this case, it would only be a question of moving one of these elections around if at some point, many decades hence, an accident of the diary meant that the two happened to coincide on the same day, and therefore, in order to comply with the constraint that they can't happen on the same day, one of them would have to move, whereupon this power would apply. If I can come back to the point, I was talking, Mr. Meal, about the online voter registration system and the way that needs to be adjusted, if necessary, if it is to be adjusted, with mutual consent, if I can put it that way, on both sides. Because, as I said, the Assembly is free to decide on the franchise and the registration process for Assembly elections. But as a practical matter, where the Welsh Government wants changes to the Great Britain-wide digital service, they will need the approval of UK government ministers to do so. And that's because the digital service is a series of interconnecting digital applications, including online voter registration, for people living in England, Wales and Scotland, as well as British citizens resident overseas. We all need to ensure that any changes to the franchise or registration process for Welsh Assembly and local government elections in Wales does not adversely impact on voters in other parts of the UK or abroad. With these considerations in mind, this clause allows Welsh ministers to make regulations concerning the digital service in relation to Assembly and local government election in Wales with the agreement of a Minister of the Crown. I therefore beg to move that Clause 5 stand part of the bill.
Hugh Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I firstly apologise to the House for my voice today? My daughter Entley came back from nursery the other day with a slight tickle, and this has led to World War III breaking out in my larynx, unfortunately. I rise to signal my group's support for clauses 5, 6 and 7, that they should stand part of this bill, but preferably along with our amendments 28, 29, 30, 31 to clause 6, which stand in my name and in the names of my honourable friends. To be plain, these are probing amendments, and I would be interested in hearing the Minister's response. Now, as the Assembly has grown in competence, it is reasonable, I think, for the power over the timing of its own elections, as well as powers over the conduct of those elections and the registration of electors, that these should be devolved. Any ambitious democratic body would surely seek such powers. The amendments in this group, as members on both sides of the House, I'm sure, will be aware, were originally drafted and published by the Office of the Presiding Officer of the National Assembly. In a letter dated the 30th of June, the Presiding Officer set out the aim of this set of amendments, and I quote, as to deliver a constitutional settlement that is workable, clear, and provides a firm foundation for the Assembly's future. She notes in the same letter that these amendments were informed by evidence given during pre-legislative scrutiny of the previous draft Wales Bill to the then Assembly's Constitutional and Legislative Affairs Committee, and are equally informed by the Assembly's experience of working under the current settlement. The aim of amendments 28 through to 31 would be to transfer the power to vary the dates of an ordinary general election, as well as the power to fix the date of an extraordinary Assembly election from the Secretary of State directly to the presiding officer of the National Assembly, rather than to Welsh ministers. The amendments are underpinned by the principle that the Assembly should have powers over its own internal affairs. It is worth pointing out, I think, as a context, that the Fixed Term Parliaments Act sets a precedent for moving decision-making over the administration of elections away from the government. Our amendments in this group, though probing, have the same underlying principle at their roots, that is, that powers over determining the dates of Assembly elections should be moved away from the government. To our mind, this power should not be conferred onto the executive, so as to remove the possibility of any accusations of political interference. Were the change to be made, as with our amendments, it would add to the competence and responsibility of the legislature, which would surely be welcomed by all parties. It would also, I would argue, increase public confidence in the independence and nature of election management in Wales. So, as drafted, the bill transfers the power to vary the dates of an ordinary Assembly general election from the Secretary of State to Welsh ministers. This is in some contrast to the system operated in Scotland, whereby this power is bestowed on the presiding officer. Amendment 28 would put the Welsh Assembly's arrangements on the same footing. Assembly 29 relates to the conferring powers over varying the dates of an ordinary general election. I would note at this juncture that whilst the bill devolves powers over electoral arrangements, it does so, I think, in an unnecessarily impractical way. I will take a point, of course.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Could he just expand a little bit on his thinking about why this would be helpful? There are different approaches to this, as he will appreciate, and I'm wondering whether or not he believes that, that there is anything unclear about the triggers which might be imposed or satisfied under the Fixed Term Parliament Act in terms of whether or not a majority have been achieved in a particular assembly or indeed in a particular parliament, or whether or not he has other concerns for potential political gameplay, and whether or not he believes as well that it might put the presiding officer in a politically contentious position. I just wondered if he sort of can expand a little bit on his thinking there.
I certainly have considered that, and it's certainly my opinion, and hers, in fact, that it would not put her in that particularly difficult position. I think, as I said, these amendments are hers after consideration, and also that's, I think, the point of parity and similarity with Scotland is a persuasive one in to our mind. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Isn't it the point that the bill as drafted, essentially the Welsh Government could act unilaterally if it's so decided, whereas if the spirit of the amendments were accepted and adopted by the Government and implemented in the bill, the power would reside with the presiding officer, but only after the support of the legislature, which would essentially mean there would have to be cross-party support before she acted.
Well, I take my honourable friend's point entirely. The outcome of Assembly elections, of course, over, 4 elections now, have not produced a majority government. And so the consent of the Assembly, collectively, would be required in that situation. And, I mean, I'm not casting any aspersions at all about the motives of governments in Cardiff, London, or anywhere else for that matter. But it would remove any suspicion of political advantage being sought. And a further point I wanted to make is that by adding a strict 7-day time frame during which the period the Assembly must meet and elect a presiding officer, this bill again, once again puts Wales on an unequal footing with Scotland. The Scottish Parliament is allowed 14 days to carry out this function. Given the history of the outcomes to our elections to the Assembly, as I said a moment ago, and the obvious consequences, that time has been required for the parties to discuss all manner of arrangements. 7 days for this particular exercise seems to me to be unreasonable. That is why Amendment 29 extends this period to 14 days for the Welsh Assembly. Amendment 30 amends the Government of Wales Act 2006 so as to confer powers over varying the dates of an ordinary general election to the presiding officer, as opposed to transferring this power directly to Welsh ministers, as currently drafted. Finally, Amendment 31 amends the 2006 Act so as to ensure that powers over proposing the dates of an extraordinary general election are given to the presiding officer. The amendment once again extends the time frame during which the Assembly is required to meet following the election to 14 days, again thus establishing parity with Scotland. These amendments, as I said, are meant to probe and promote discussion, so we do not intend to press them to a vote. Thank you.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Mead. I thank the honourable gentleman for sort of laying out his case so clearly and so helpfully. And I think that he's absolutely right, that there is an apparent difference at the moment between the provisions in this bill, which seek simply to mimic the existing provisions when it comes to the powers that we're talking about in his 4 amendments, and simply devolve the existing arrangements from the Secretary of State down to Welsh ministers. But he is also right to point out that this is not quite the same thing as has already happened in a parallel situation in Scotland, where those powers were not devolved to Scottish ministers, they were devolved instead to the equivalent of the private presiding officer in Scotland. So we have already within British constitutional arrangements two parallel but subtly different approaches. And the reason I stood to ask my question of him is that there are competing views. I'm not sure that either of them is necessarily automatically better or worse than each other, but there are different strengths and weaknesses and different pros and cons of both arguments. Some people are concerned that if you devolve this kind of power to a presiding officer, that it could possibly put a presiding officer in a potentially politically contentious position. I don't think that is the view of either the Scottish presiding officer or indeed, as I understand it, necessarily of the Welsh presiding officer or indeed of many politicians in the Welsh Assembly. But there would be some who would certainly cleave to that view, perhaps here, for example. Equally, the question, of course, is whether or not the criteria that has to be satisfied in the event that a particular parliament, a fixed-term parliament, can be altered in length and an early extraordinary general election can be called, whether or not those criteria are clear. So, for example, for here, the Fixed-Term Parliament Act says that you either have to have a government which cannot command a majority and over 2 weeks has failed to find an alternative majority, or a two-thirds majority. Now, those are fairly clear criteria, and therefore there's relatively little opportunity for political game playing to happen, either for ministers or indeed for a presiding officer. I'll happily give way.
Intervention on that one. Well, whilst I'm very grateful to the Minister for the tone of his reply and for his clarification, but on reading up on the potential implications of the Brexit situation, whereby the new Prime Minister may decide to call a snap election, would it not be possible under the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act for the new Prime Minister to call a vote of no confidence in him or herself, therefore triggering an election?
Mr. Smith, I think that counts as the gentleman should, honourable gentleman, if he's not already in his party's whip's office, probably should be. That's a proper whip's office wheeze he's suggesting there. I suspect probably that were such a thing to be legally possible, and I will defer to others to decide if it would be, I think it would not pass the test of democratic credibility. And I think that any government that sought to precipitate its own downfall through that kind of a mechanism, voting against itself and saying that we are not competent, would probably be judged quite harshly by voters in the polls as a practical matter if they did. But we're talking in theoretical and theoretical circumstances, I appreciate. And we will have to leave that to the future to decide. But the point I was trying to make was that there are legitimate, I think, arguments on both sides, and we already have, within British constitutional arrangements, both these two systems persisting quite happily side by side, one here, one in Scotland, and this question being raised for the Welsh Assembly as well. And so I don't want to say that one is inherently either legitimate or illegitimate, one is not necessarily better or worse than the other. I think it has to be a question of what is acceptable to the local decision makers, in this case the Assembly members and their officials in the Welsh Assembly. And therefore I think we are very sympathetic to taking this away and thinking about it very carefully. And I do thank him for raising this issue. I think it is a very thought-provoking case that he's making. And if he will agree, I would be very happy to take this away. I think he's indicated this is a probing amendment, so I'd be delighted to take this away, perhaps consult with my fellow ministers and see whether or not we can take this forward, or at least develop the ideas and the thinking a little further.
The question is that Clause 5 stand part of the bill. As many of the opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that Clause 6 stand part of the bill. As many of the opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that Clause 7 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come on to Group 3, Amendment 32, with which it will be convenient to consider the other amendments, clauses and new clauses, and schedule listed in the select paper.